This is a really common position to be in. The racial diversity of teachers does not mirror the racial diversity of our students. So it's very likely that you will find yourself in a position where you're teaching students who have a different cultural or racial or ethnic background than you do. We could get into some of the reasons for that and why that is sometimes problematic. That is a topic for another video, but let's talk about what we can do. So 2 years ago, I started working in a new district at a new school where the majority of my students are either from China or from India. And to be honest, I had not had a whole lot of experience with or exposure to Chinese or Indian communities. So I definitely had a lot to learn. And as I've kind of acclimated to this school's environment and to this community, there are a few things that I have learned, and number one, it starts with humility. I had to go in understanding that I don't know everything there is to know, or even hardly anything that there is to know. Plus, I live in Southern California. Even my own family is multiracial, and so this isn't a new situation for me, but just as I've thought more intentionally and more critically about what it means to be in a position of power within a community where I am not part of the majority, I've recognized 3 key things that I always have to keep in mind. I believe that in order to be someone who successfully builds relationship and builds community with groups of people that are different from yourself, it requires education, exposure, and empathy. I think that these 3 things can be applied to students, they can be applied to the general public, but today I'm going to talk about how those 3 things are essential for teachers. Ever since I've kind of started putting situations through that frame, I felt like it's been really helpful for me to look at things that way. I think all 3 of these E's, education, exposure, and empathy, are probably equally important, so there's no rhyme or reason to which one I'm starting with, but let's start with exposure. This might seem like a given, but exposure is really essential in order to have any understanding of another culture. I hear a lot of people from communities, that are maybe like 98% white, talk about how they are like very tolerant and not racist, and I'm like, okay, yeah, that's fine, but without exposure to other people, you never even get a chance to like practice any of that. So putting yourself in a position where you are not the majority and you are not necessarily the one in charge is really, really critical. I think one place that we see this is people don't have a problem with like having students that are from a different background that they are, but sometimes when you have someone in a position of power and authority above you, that's when people start to get uncomfortable. So I actually love the fact that my principal is female, Southeast Asian, and Muslim. I love being submitted to the authority of someone who is different from me and someone who understands being an outsider. I think that that's actually a great asset for leaders. So I know that you don't always have a ton of control over the exposure that you receive to other cultures, but I think that if you are an adult and it's important to you to be someone who is an ally to communities that are different than yours, you need to go seek out situations where you have exposure to those communities and where you come in as a guest and with humility and as someone who is learning about different people. So I can see is education, and of course that I believe that education is important. And if you are working in a community like I do with many students who are different from yourself, the onus is on you to educate yourself about their culture and their histories. So I take advantage of every opportunity to learn more about Chinese history and Indian history. USC isn't far from me, and they offer free lectures for teachers from like world-renowned professors in Chinese history, and I go to those every chance that I can. I'm currently reading a book called At America's Gates, which is about Chinese immigration. One of my students this year invited me to a Hindu teacher appreciation ceremony, and it was several hours long, but they did such an amazing job just educating us teachers about their beliefs beliefs and how they view teachers or gurus. They fed us, they did performances for us. That was an amazing opportunity. If you ever have opportunities to do things like that and educate yourself more about what your students do in their off time from school and what their parents do and what their families value, you need to do that. It's not easy for me to find somebody to watch my 2-year-old and to take time away from my teaching responsibilities and even like my social media responsibilities, but I think that it's so important for me to gain as much knowledge as I possibly can in order to be an effective teacher and just in order to be an effective human person that interacts with families and students every day. So whether you is empathy, and we can all build this up in ourselves. I think as you do the other 2 E's, as you're exposed to more people who are different from you, and as you educate yourself more about things you didn't know about, your empathy does just naturally grow. But that's definitely something that you have to look inward to kind of assess about yourself. Do you quickly stereotype people? Do you make judgments about people in a sweeping way, like all immigrants are this or all Asians are this? And to a certain extent, we all do that a little bit. We all have biases. There's a lot of information for our brains to take in every day, and in order for our brains to process everything quickly, we categorize certain things. And sometimes society or our parents or our families or like one negative experience has created this connection in our brain where we categorize certain people in a certain way. But you can undo those connections, again, through more exposure and more education and just being open to the idea that you might not be right. You might not know everything there is to know about everyone around you, and acknowledging that within yourself, you might prejudge people sometimes. So another resource that I would offer you for this is Facing History and Ourselves does some great work with looking at your own identity. For one thing, it's very difficult to do any of this work when you're in denial about your own identity. And particularly white people tend to feel like they don't have an identity, they don't have a cultural identity. I just remembered that I had this book sitting here, So You Want to Talk About Race. This one is really great for white educators to read. I also love the book White Awake by Daniel Hill. I know I've recommended that quite a few times. There are a lot of books out there for educators, particularly white educators who teach black kids in the hood, for example. And part of working on your own empathy is being aware of your own identity, recognizing your own biases, and taking control over that, understanding your own privilege. And rather than feeling attacked, or if someone tells you you have privilege, instead of hearing that you didn't work for whatever you have or everything is given to you and you have no struggles, I think that's what people tend to hear, is just understanding that you have some doors that are open to you and some opportunities to do good in the world that other people might not automatically have, and you can use that privilege to do good, but you